A recent article in Declassified revealed that the UK government has spent at least £350 million promoting the so-called armed opposition forces and projects in terrorist-held areas in Syria. While the UK claimed that several projects have directly supported the moderate armed opposition fighting the regime of President Bashar al-Assad, facts on the ground indicate that moderate rebels do not exist and Islamist terrorists are in fact carrying the fight against Assad. The controversial Conflict Stability and Security Fund (CSSF) has used large amounts of money from the British aid budget in areas of Syria where extremist groups are prevalent. The author of the article, Mark Curtis, is confident that the UK has pursued with this subsidy to install a pro-Western government in Damascus and nurture opposition-held areas as an alternative to Assad's rule. The UK offers inconsistent numbers on what extent it backs up the Syrian opposition. It was communicated to the parliament in March 2018 that funding like this through CSSF is approximately calculated to be £32 million for the period of 2011-2017, which contained political support and non-lethal equipment. Nonetheless, a few months back, in September 2017, Lord Ahmad, who is the foreign minister, stated that the CSSF funding for Syria is approximately calculated to be £199 million for the 3 years to 2017-2018. Lord Ahmad stated that this counted in funds to those groups opposed to ISIS and Assad, as well as Syrian civilians and their communities. Back in December 2015, the UK government specified it had offered more than £67 million to the opposition of Syria, counting armed opposition, the Syrian National Coalition, and media activists. Declassified was capable of stating that in the period of 5 years, the CSSF has subsidized 13 projects worth £250 million that support the Syrian opposition and its delivery of facilities in areas held by the so-called rebels. For a long time, the UK has been a momentous supporter of the media operations by the Syrian opposition. In 2016, journalist Jan Cobain exposed that the UK government was waging information warfare in Syria by backing media actions for some aggressive rebel groups. The UK financed 5 covert events in Syria that started in 2012, including the formation of a citizen reporters network throughout the state to shape insights, views, and opinions of the dispute. The UK was exposed to be secretly responsible for the activity happening in parts of the Syrian opposition. It bestowed agreements to communication firms that selected and trained opposition representatives, handled their press offices, and even settled their accounts on social media. As per an internal review of the initiative revealed by Cobain, these secret propaganda programs were poorly planned, probably illegal, and cost lives. It has been prospected that some of these projects might be running still. For example, a program called Future Syria Program, which is valued to be around £6.96 million in the period of 2019-2021, presents one goal as Russian regime narrative are challenged and disinformation countered. UK's secret action in the Syrian war has been noticeably underreported as well as misreported in the United Kingdom. Even though media has extensively concealed UK armed actions against ISIS, its secret maneuvers countering Assad and its sustenance of opposition groups have attracted consideration to a very small extent. The mass media has repeated administration lines regarding massacres and violence staged by the Assad government. Nonetheless, opposition powers have been offered a free pass mostly. A lot of reports fail to note that in quite a lot of parts of Syria, rebel groups are subjugated or prejudiced by radicals. Evidence suggests Britain began covert operations against the Assad government in late 2011 or early 2012. The external intelligence agency MI6 was allegedly a part in the transportation of the arms and ammunition, training, and systematizing the opposition in a covert operation with its allies from the United States and the Middle East. Therefore, covert and overt policies in support of the Syrian rebels by foreign actors such as the UK helped them to turn the uprising into a civil war and contributed to prolonging it, according to Mark Curtis. To further elaborate these important points, I asked British independent investigative journalist Vanessa Beeley on the UK's collusion with the terrorist groups in Syria. Vanessa, the UK has spent hundreds of millions from taxpayer funds to destabilize Syria and eventually replace President Assad with a puppet government headed by characters such as Guaido or Navalny, right? And to do so, the UK funded the so-called Syrian opposition through the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, CSSF. Can you please tell us who are the CSSF, and according to your investigation, how much funds has it sent to terrorist-held areas in Syria?
The CSSF was actually created in 2015. It was previously known as the Conflict Pool. And effectively, this is a cross-government department slush fund of 1.26 billion as it currently stands. So it's a pretty phenomenal fund. Now, the recent article at Declassified UK has identified, I think, 13 programs. Sorry, I'm having to read it off because I've been spending a lot of time on the figures this morning. In the last 5 years. So 13 programs, 215 million. But they do talk about a 350 million regime change operation by the British government through the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. So it was created in 2015. Now, here we have the interesting timing, because the White Helmets, which was incubated by a former British military intelligence officer, James Le Mesurier, who died in 2019 in Istanbul, was established in 2013. In 2014, James Le Mesurier established Mayday Rescue, effectively a contractor that would funnel the financing from the CSSF to the White Helmets. And in 2015, the Conflict Stability and Security Fund was established, effectively to move money around from the Department for International Development that until 2017 had expended 726 million in Syrian humanitarian aid. And we can't forget that the UK makes claims of 2.7 billion in total humanitarian aid in Syria and the surrounding region, so encompassing the areas that have taken in refugees. Now, when I started to look into the actual funding of the CSSF, as I said, it becomes a little bit more complicated. There are certain programs that Mark Curtis has omitted from his report that include, for example, the White Helmets, Mayday Rescue, Incostrat, which was an organization established by the widow of James Le Mesurier, Emma Winberg, with another former military officer, Paul Tilley, in order to provide the media backup for groups like Jaish al-Islam, who occupied Eastern Ghouta, and particularly during the alleged chemical attack in Douma in 2018. So this organization, funded by the CSSF, was directly providing media and PR support for one of the most brutal armed groups operating inside Syria. Between 2012 to March 2020, it is recorded that the UK spent 3.2 billion in the region, 1.4 billion in Syria. Now that includes the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. They identify 30 implementing partners, which would presumably include companies like Mayday Rescue, Incostrat, Adam Smith International, Integrity Global, etc. So effectively, in my opinion, what the CSSF is, and it was found to be lacking in transparency by a parliamentary national security committee that investigated the fund in 2017. So for me, the CSSF is a tool of British intelligence agencies and UK Foreign Office outreach agents to infiltrate Syria and to fund that infiltration. In other words, to fund what they called euphemistically the implementing contractors or the agencies that are effectively carrying out their instructions inside Syria, funded by the British government. But what that does is to give them plausible deniability when something goes wrong, when they're exposed as having siphoned money erroneously to armed groups dominated by Al-Qaeda, for example, in northwest Syria. And of course, in 2017, I actually identified the fact that through the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, who were giving money to Integrity Global and Adam Smith International, they were effectively funding Al-Qaeda and the White Helmets, who were at that point being led by an Al-Qaeda operative, Abdulaziz Maghribi. Now, Maghribi was a member of the Al-Tawhid Brigade that invaded East Aleppo, as you know, in 2012. He then became a militant with Abu Amara and then a leader in Nusra Front. While a leader of Nusra Front, he was elected to the presidency of local councils, which were funded by the Tamkeen project, so funded indirectly through Adam Smith International. And he also became the leader of the White Helmet group in his particular district. So as I pointed out, there indirectly, the Conflict Stability and Security Fund were effectively financing Al-Qaeda operatives inside East Aleppo. Now, immediately after that report, BBC Panorama put out a report exposing the fact that Adam Smith International had been doing exactly the same with the so-called Free Syrian Police, and that there was a danger of those funds being misdirected into the hands of the terrorist groups that the Free Syrian Police collaborated with. However, of course, they failed to mention the fact that the White Helmets, exactly the same thing was happening with the White Helmets. And 1 month after the BBC Panorama program, which was a cover-up, Alistair Burt, who's the Minister of State for the Middle East, reinstated funding to Adam Smith International. So effectively, for me, the Conflict Stability and Security Fund is a way for the British government to avoid transparency regarding its indirect funding of terrorist groups inside Syria and its assistance, its providing of strategic communications and media backup for those groups.
Vanessa, the UK refuses to say which moderate rebel group have received British funding. Do we know the names of these terrorist groups, and why is Britain so hesitant of naming them?
Well, almost without fail, when freedom of information requests are made to the British government or questions are raised, for example, in the House of Lords, the response is we provide non-lethal aid to moderate opposition. And we don't divulge the names of those groups for security reasons. Now, those security reasons are never really explained. I mean, is it security for the armed group? Is it security for the British government? It's an interesting statement. But in 2018, questions were raised of Alistair Burt, as I said, the Minister of State for the Middle East. And during those questions, he admitted that representatives of the British government had been in contact with representatives from al-Sham. And of course, we can't forget that Labib al-Nahas was given a platform in the British Telegraph, and also, I can't remember which American media it was right now. But effectively, he was given media coverage to a huge extent to try and normalize al-Sham as moderate opposition, despite the fact, of course, they carried out ethnic cleansing programs, particularly in Nubal and Zara in the Aleppo countryside. Now, Bert admitted that representatives had been in touch with members of Al-Sham as part of the political process for the future in Syria. So effectively, they're admitting that they considered an extremist, sectarian, brutal armed group to be a viable opposition prospect for the future in Syria. So that's number one. Number two, they were asked to what extent they had provided backup for Jaish al-Islam, the group that I mentioned earlier, who were operating predominantly in eastern Ghouta, but of course now also are in Idlib, and who carried out, it must be said, a suspected chemical weapon attack against the Kurdish communities in northern Aleppo in 2016 that was even recorded by the likes of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. Now, Bert's response to the request of information regarding Jaish al-Islam was more, let's say, disingenuous. He basically said, we provide non-lethal aid, blah, blah, blah. But of course, what he omitted to mention is through the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, they were funding Inkastrat, that were providing media and Stratcom intelligence support for Jaish al-Islam. And of course, the White Helmets were working, funded by the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, were working alongside Jaish al-Islam and effectively providing this media support for them. So while they are prevaricating over which armed groups they are working with, clearly they are indirectly working with Al-Qaeda. They have admitted working with Jaish al-Islam and Al-Sham, both of which are not designated internationally terrorist groups except by Russia, but are among the largest and the most extremist groups operating inside Syria.
Vanessa, a parliamentary committee has compared the CSSF to a slush fund for financing projects that do not meet the needs of UK national security. Do you expect a push against the UK government as it happened against the Dutch government, which stopped its funding of terrorist groups in Syria in 2018?
I don't really expect it. We had an opportunity for that possibly when Jeremy Corbyn was leading the opposition in the UK. But now I would say that there is very little definition between, or rather, sorry, there's very little differentiation between the Tory party and the Labour Party with Keir Starmer in charge. Both of them now, I mean, the Labour Party is now just converted back into a Blairite neocon entity. And so I don't, there isn't the opposition that is organized enough, strong enough to be able to push back against British government policy inside Syria. And the questions that come in from members of the House of Lords that are aware of effectively the criminal policy of the UK government, including, of course, the sadistic sanctions that are being imposed on the Syrian people by the UK and the US and EU. So I don't myself see any strong arm opposition to the misuse of British taxpayer funds indirectly into the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. No.
Vanessa Beeley, thank you very much for your great insight. Guys, thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, please hit the subscribe button and like it and share it on social media. And if you like to support Syriana analysis and my independent commentary and journalistic work, you can become my patron. All the links in the description below, and see you next time.